During my birthday dinner, my son's wife announced, "This house is ours now." I reached into my bag and pulled out something that made her face go completely white. They thought I was just a sweet old lady who would smile, nod, and hand over everything I had spent my entire life building. They thought 80 years had made me soft, made me slow, made me easy. They forgot something very important. The older the woman, the deeper the roots. And my roots go all the way down to the bone. Hi, my name is Vivienne Claire Hartwell, and I am 80 years old, sitting right here in my kitchen, in the house I have lived in for 51 years, drinking my chamomile tea from the same blue ceramic mug I have used every single morning since 1987, about to tell you the most extraordinary story of my life. A story about greed. A story about betrayal from a direction I never fully expected. A story about a woman who walked into my home with a rehearsed smile and carefully chosen words and a plan she had been building for years. And most importantly, a story about how this old grandmother, this supposedly fragile and easily forgotten woman, had been quietly preparing her own plan far longer than anyone knew. I was born in 1945 in Savannah, Georgia. If you have never been to Savannah, I want you to picture Spanish moss hanging low from ancient oak trees, the smell of magnolia drifting through open windows in the spring, the sound of the Savannah River at night, slow and wide and full of something that feels like history. I grew up in a modest wooden house on the east side of the city with my parents, Harold and Louise, and my two older brothers, James and Curtis. We were not wealthy people. My father worked at the paper mill and my mother took in sewing and cleaned houses 3 days a week. But we were dignified people. My mother was a woman who ironed everything, including the dish towels. My father never missed a Sunday at church. They taught us that your name is the only thing that belongs entirely to you, and you protect it accordingly. From the time I was a small girl, I was different from most of the children around me in one particular way. I loved numbers. I loved the way numbers behaved, the way they obeyed rules, the way they could not lie to you if you read them correctly. While other children were playing outside after school, I was sitting at the kitchen table with whatever I could find to count and calculate. My mother would shake her head and say, "Vivienne, you are going to either be very rich or very strange, and I am not sure which one I am praying for." She said it with a smile, so I always took it as a compliment. I graduated high school in 1963 and won a partial academic scholarship to Georgia State. In 1963, a young, black woman from a working family going to university was not a small thing. It required sacrifice from every member of my family. James gave up his plan to buy a car. Curtis worked overtime at the warehouse and sent money home. My parents ate less so that I could eat enough. I knew exactly what it cost, and I made sure every single day that it was worth it. I graduated in 1967 with a degree in accounting and business administration, and I walked across that stage feeling like I was carrying my entire family on my shoulders, and I was proud to carry them. I want to tell you something about what it meant to graduate in 1967 with an accounting degree and be a young black woman looking for work in the American South. It meant that you walked into rooms where people immediately tried to put you somewhere smaller than where you belonged. It meant that you heard the word overqualified used as a polite way of saying unwanted. It meant that you learned very early to let your work be so precise, so thorough, so beyond reproach, that it became impossible to dismiss you without dismissing the numbers themselves. And numbers do not care about the color of your skin or the shape of your name or whether you remind someone of their assumptions. Numbers are honest. That is why I loved them. That is why I still love them. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1968 to take a job as a junior bookkeeper at a regional bank. Charlotte was growing fast in those years, and the financial sector was growing with it. I worked harder than anyone around me because I had to. I was a woman. I was black. I was young. Every single thing I achieved against a resistance that most people around me did not have to push against. Men who had been at the bank half as long as me were promoted over me. I was asked to take notes in meetings where I was the most qualified person in the room. I was mistaken for secretarial staff by people who should have known better. I smiled. I documented everything. I kept my performance numbers so clean and so undeniable that eventually, the numbers spoke louder than anyone's assumptions. In 1979, I became the first woman and the first black senior financial analyst in that bank's history. I kept that position, earned 2 promotions after it, and retired in 1998 with 30 years of service and a record that I'm still proud of today. I tell you all of this not to boast, though at 80 years old I have earned the right to boast a little if I want to. I tell you this because I need you to understand who sits at the center of this story. Not a confused old woman who did not understand what was happening to her. Not a frail grandmother who needed protecting. But a woman who spent 30 years reading financial documents, catching fraud, identifying manipulation in spreadsheets and contracts and conversations, and being right about it nearly every single time. Now let me tell you about George. George Hartwell came into my life at a church social in the spring of 1968, 3 months after I arrived in Charlotte. He was tall and quiet and had the most careful, deliberate hands I had ever seen on a man. He was an architect, which suited him perfectly, because everything George did was measured and precise and built to last. He did not talk much at that church social. He stood near the window with a cup of punch and watched everything with a calm, attentive expression. And I thought, that man sees more than he says. I was right about that. In 47 years of marriage, I was rarely wrong about George. On our second date, he took me to see a building he had designed for a small law firm downtown. We stood outside it in the early evening and he told me everything he had been thinking about when he designed it. The way the windows were angled to catch morning light, the proportions of the entrance that were meant to feel welcoming rather than imposing, the small courtyard in the back that nobody would ever see from the street, but that he had designed as carefully as the front facade because, he said, quality does not stop where the public eye stops. I stood there listening to him and I thought, this is a man who believes in doing things properly when no one is watching. That is the rarest quality there is. We were married in September of 1969 in a small ceremony at my family's church in Savannah, with my mother crying from the first hymn to the last prayer, which she would always deny afterward. George carried my mother's bags to the car after the reception and called her ma'am for the rest of her life. She adored him. My father shook his hand at the reception and said, George, that woman is the best thing our family has ever produced. You take care of her. George looked at my father and said, Sir, I intend to. And he did. Every single day for 47 years. We bought our house in 1972. It was not much to look at then. A colonial-style frame house on a 2-acre lot in a suburb of Charlotte that was only just beginning to develop. But George saw what it could become. The way architects see potential in a structure that the rest of us can only see after the work is done. We paid $38,000 for it, which took everything we had saved in 3 years of living on almost nothing. We put our names on that deed together, and we stood in the empty living room and George said, Vivienne, everything we build from here, we build on this ground. And we did. Over the following decades, we extended the house twice, both times designed by George himself. We updated the kitchen in 1985. We put in a proper study in 1991. We landscaped the garden ourselves over many weekends, planting the dogwood trees along the back fence that are now enormous and glorious every spring. We paid off the mortgage in 1989. We raised our son Thomas in those rooms, watched him grow from a baby to a man, celebrated every milestone in that house, buried both sets of parents within those years, and grieved and recovered, and kept going the way people do when they have a home that holds them steady. Thomas learned to walk in the living room, took his first steps from the coffee table to the armchair while George and I sat on the floor watching with our hands stretched toward him. He broke his arm falling from the oak tree in the backyard in 1977, and George carried him too. The car wrapped in a blue towel, and I drove them to the emergency room holding Thomas's good hand the whole way. He brought his first girlfriend home to dinner in 1983 and was so nervous he knocked over the salt shaker twice. He graduated high school from that house, graduated college from that house, came back to that house for every Thanksgiving and Christmas for the next 30 years. George and I used to sit on the back porch in the evenings after Thomas had grown and gone and talk about what it had meant to raise a child in this place. George would say, "Vivienne, we did something real here." And I would say, "Yes, George, we did something real." George passed away in June of 2015. Massive heart attack. He was sitting in his chair in the study reading the newspaper and he was simply gone before the ambulance arrived. I was in the garden when it happened. I had been deadheading the roses along the back fence, something George always said I did too aggressively, and I came inside with dirt on my gloves and called his name and got no answer and found him in the chair with the newspaper still open across his lap. I held his hand for a long time before I called anyone. I just sat on the floor next to his chair and held his hand and talked to him, telling him things I needed him to hear, things I am not going to share here, because they belonged only to the two of us. Then I called Thomas, and then I called the ambulance, and then I sat back down and held his hand again until they arrived. I will not dwell on the grief because it is still, after 10 years, a country I can only visit briefly before I have to come back out. What I will tell you is that George's death left me alone in a house that contained 50 years of a shared life, and that I was 69 years old, retired, healthy, financially stable, and absolutely determined to stay exactly where I was. Some people thought I would sell. Some people said kindly meant things about fresh starts and new chapters. I thanked them, and I stayed. Every room in that house holds George. Every corner, every wall, every window he chose the framing for. I was not going to walk away from that. I am still not going to walk away from that. Thomas was 50 in 2015, living with his then wife in a house about 40 minutes away. He came over constantly in those first months after George died, and I was grateful. He is my only child, and the love between us has always been real and deep. We would sit together in the evenings and talk about his father and eat whatever one of us had cooked, and it helped. It genuinely helped. Those were hard months, but Thomas made them more bearable. He and his first wife separated in 2016. I won't go into that, because it is his private matter. What I will tell you is that by the end of 2016, Thomas was single, and in 2017 he met Rebecca. I will be honest with you and tell you that my instincts about Rebecca were not positive from the very first meeting. She was 38 years old, very polished, very controlled in the way she spoke and held herself, with eyes that moved around a room the way a person's eyes move when they are inventorying it rather than appreciating it. She looked at my house during that first visit the way someone looks at real estate they are considering purchasing. A slow, measuring look. She admired the garden and asked how large the lot was. She asked whether the extension had been permitted properly. She asked whether I had considered downsizing now that I was living alone. And all of this within the first 2 hours of our introduction. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Thomas was happy. Rebecca was accomplished and capable, and she made my son smile. I decided to give her every benefit of the doubt I had. Thomas and Rebecca married in the spring of 2018. A small wedding, the expenses for which I contributed significantly, something that was received without much acknowledgement and never mentioned again. After the wedding, the Sunday dinners began. Rebecca was pleasant at these dinners. She brought wine, asked after my health, engaged in conversation. But slowly, beginning around late 2019 and accelerating through 2020, things began to change. The comments started, small ones at first. Vivienne, have you thought about updating this kitchen? Vivienne, this house is a lot to maintain for one person, isn't it? Vivienne, I read about this lovely senior community in Valentine. Very active social scene, you'd love it. And I would smile and say thank you for thinking of me, and I would change the subject. But I was not missing what was happening. I was filing it away, the way I used to file financial irregularities at the bank. One anomaly is nothing. A pattern is something else entirely. Around the same time, I noticed that Thomas was calling less often. This was gradual enough that it might have been easy to dismiss as the natural drift of a busy adult life. But I paid attention. I kept, not formally but in my mind, a rough accounting of contact frequency. In 2017 and early 2018, Thomas called me 3 to 4 times a week without fail. By 2020, it was once a week. By 2021, some weeks there was no call unless I initiated it. And when I did call and Rebecca was nearby, the conversations became shorter, more surface level, with Thomas sometimes saying, "I should let you go, Mom," which was a phrase he had never used with me before in his life. I am a financial analyst. Isolation is a tactic. I recognized it. In 2021, the brochures appeared. Senior living communities, memory care facilities, retirement villages. Rebecca would leave them on my kitchen counter when they visited, always framed as something she had just thought of, always with a smile and the language of concern. I would thank her. I would put them in the recycling bin the moment they left. My physician, who has seen me every quarter since 2010, will confirm for anyone who asks that I am in excellent health. I take one medication for blood pressure that has been stable for years. I am sharp, mobile, independent, and have never once given any professional in my life any reason to suggest I cannot manage my own affairs. By 2022, Thomas had joined in with the pressure. Not unkindly. I want to be fair to him. He seemed genuinely worried, which told me that Rebecca had been working on him consistently. "Mum, what if something happens? Mum, that house is a lot. Mum, we just want to make sure you're safe." And underneath every conversation, the unspoken question that I could hear as clearly as anything spoken aloud: what is going to happen to the house? Because by 2022, my house was worth something. The neighborhood we had bought into for $38,000 in 1972 had become one of the most desirable suburbs in Greater Charlotte. Properties were selling for $800,000, some over $1 million for larger lots. My house, on 2 acres, beautifully maintained, with George's, thoughtful extensions and a garden, that had matured over 50 years into something genuinely beautiful, was worth considerably more than most of the surrounding properties. I knew exactly what it was, worth because I had had it appraised, independently in 2021, purely for my own knowledge. The number did not surprise me. The clarity it gave me about what was motivating certain conversations was useful. In early 2023, the questions turned toward my financial arrangements. Subtle, always wrapped in the language of care. Thomas asking whether I had updated my will recently. Thomas wondering whether the house was in my name alone, or in some kind of trust. Rebecca asking, with a bright smile, whether I had ever thought about adding Thomas to the deed, just for simplicity. Just so things would be easy if anything ever happened. That last one was the one that told me everything I needed to know with complete certainty. Because adding someone to a deed is not simplicity. Adding someone to a deed is a transfer of ownership rights. I know exactly what adding someone to a deed means. I wrote reports about it for 30 years. The week after that conversation, I called my attorney Sandra. I have worked with Sandra since 2001 and she is one of the sharpest legal minds I have ever encountered. I sat in her office and I told her everything from the beginning. Every comment, every brochure, every question about the deed. And I watched her face go very still, in the way it goes when she is taking something seriously. She did not interrupt me once. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in her small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she put down her pen and she said, "Vivienne, you were right to come in. How long has this been going on?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And you have told no one else?" I said, "Only my neighbor, Carol." She said, "Good. Keep it that way for now." Sandra and I spent 3 months reviewing and restructuring everything. We met 5 times in her office. We went through my will line by line. We reviewed my property documents, going all the way back to the original 1972 deed. We examined my investment accounts, my insurance policies, my banking arrangements. We established the Vivienne Claire Hartwell Living Trust, which placed my property and primary assets into a trust structure managed solely by me during my lifetime. We included specific succession provisions that I will not detail publicly, and no contest clause that would result in any legal challenger receiving nothing whatsoever rather than their reduced portion, and we had every document notarized, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and filed with the County Register of Deeds. When we were done at our final meeting, Sandra sat back in her chair and looked at me with something that I recognized as professional satisfaction, and she said, "Vivienne, whatever they have planned, it is not going to work. Not 1 inch of it." I went home feeling, not triumphant exactly, but settled, prepared, way I used to feel when I had reviewed a complete portfolio and found it entirely sound. I put the key documents in a dark blue legal folder and I began carrying it in my bag whenever I went to family gatherings. Just in case. 4 months I carried that folder. 4 months of Sunday dinners and phone calls and patient, watchful waiting. And then came my 80th birthday. Thomas called 3 weeks before and said he and Rebecca wanted to host a birthday dinner for me at my house. They would cook. They would bring a few people. They would make it a real celebration. I said yes. I was glad. My neighbor and dearest friend Carol, who has known me for 30 years and who I had told everything over cups of tea on my back porch, came as my guest. Carol is 77 years old, a former school principal, with a memory like a filing cabinet and the composure of a woman who has managed 1,000 crises without raising her voice. I asked her to be there. She understood why without my needing to explain further. The other guests were Thomas, Rebecca's sister Diana, who I had met perhaps 4 times in all the years, and Diana's husband. Rebecca had cooked a proper dinner. Roast chicken with herbs, roasted root vegetables, good wine, fresh bread. I wore my blue dress. George always said it made me look younger than I felt. I had fresh flowers on the table. It was, in its surface appearance, a lovely evening. Thomas made a toast. He said things about what a wonderful mother I was, about how much I had given him, about how proud his father would have been to see me at 80. I listened and I smiled and I held my glass and I watched Rebecca's face while Thomas spoke. And in Rebecca's face I saw something I had been waiting to see for 2 years. An impatience. A controlled, barely contained readiness. She was holding herself very still, the way people hold themselves still when they are waiting for a moment they have rehearsed. She had planned something for this evening. She was waiting for her opening. The opening came after dessert, after the birthday cake, after the candles, after all 6 of us sang happy birthday, and I blew out every one of 80 candles in a single breath, which I mention only because Rebecca looked briefly startled by it, as if she had expected diminished lung capacity. I set down my fork. I picked up my tea, and Rebecca cleared her throat. She looked at Thomas briefly. He looked at the tablecloth. Then she turned to me with her most practiced, warmest smile, and she said she had some exciting news to share. She said that she and Thomas had been doing a great deal of thinking, that they had made a decision. She paused for just a moment, the way someone pauses when they want their words to land with weight. And then she said it. She said this house is ours now. She said they were moving in. She said they had already spoken to a realtor about listing their own house and that a spring move made the most sense. She said they had identified several really wonderful senior communities in the area and they were confident I was going to love it. The table went silent. I looked at Thomas. He was looking at his hands. I looked at Carol. She gave me the smallest nod. I looked at Rebecca, who was still smiling at me with that bright, prepared smile, and I felt a stillness come over me. Not anger, not in that moment. Just a cold and absolute clarity. The kind that comes when every calculation you have run for 2 years is confirmed, simultaneously, and you understand with complete certainty that your instincts were correct and your preparation was necessary. I reached into my bag. I heard Diana's husband shift in his seat. I saw Rebecca's smile flicker for just 1 second. Thomas finally looked up from the tablecloth. I reached into my bag and I removed the dark blue legal folder. I set it on the table in front of me, and I rested my hands on top of it. And I looked at Rebecca with an expression that I hope communicated the following. I have been ready for this moment for months. I said, Rebecca, that is a very interesting announcement. I would love for you to explain to me what makes you believe that this house is yours now. She blinked. Then she recovered and began explaining that Thomas was my son and only heir. That given my age and circumstances a transition, now rather than later, made sense for everyone. That the paperwork could be handled easily. I let her speak. When she finished, I said, the transition of what exactly? She said the property. I said this property. She said yes. I opened the folder. What I slid across the table was the Vivienne Claire Hartwell Living Trust document, all 42 pages of it, with the county filing stamp clearly visible on the front page. I watched Rebecca pick it up. I watched her begin to read. I watched the color slowly leave her face as she understood what she was looking at and what it meant. She passed it to Thomas. Thomas read the first several pages with an expression I had never seen on my son before. Something complicated and difficult that sat somewhere between confusion and grief and shame. I spoke quietly and I spoke clearly. I told Rebecca that I had lived in my house for 51 years, that my husband and I had purchased it, built it up, paid it off, and loved it for the entirety of our marriage, that it was mine by every legal, moral, and personal measure that existed, that I was not confused, not incapable, not in need of management, that I drove myself to church every Sunday, managed my own financial portfolio, saw my physician every 3 months and received a clean bill of health each time, and had been running my own affairs with perfect competence for 80 years, that there was no basis, legal or medical or ethical, for anyone to tell me to leave my home, and that any attempt to create such a basis would find itself facing a document prepared by one of the finest estate attorneys in Charlotte, filed with the county, witnessed, and completely airtight. Then I looked at my son. I told Thomas that I loved him, that I had always loved him and would always love him, that the love was not in question. What was in question was who he had chosen to be in the past several years, and whether that was truly the man his father and I had raised him to be. I told him that his father would have been heartbroken by what had happened at this table tonight. I said it gently. I said it once. But I said it. Thomas did not speak. His eyes filled with tears. Rebecca said I was being dramatic. I told her there was a difference between dramatic and accurate, and that what I had just done was accurate. Then I turned to Carol and asked if she would like more tea. Carol said she would love some. I stood up. walked to my kitchen and put the kettle on. I left them all sitting in the silence I had built and placed around them like a structure they could not get out of. Diana and her husband left soon after that. Diana embraced me at the door and whispered that she was sorry. And I believed her. Thomas and Rebecca stayed longer. Thomas helped clear the table without being asked, which he had not done at my home in years. Rebecca sat quietly and said very little and did not look at me directly. Before they left, Thomas came to find me in the kitchen and he held me for a long time without saying anything at first. Then he said he was sorry. He said he did not know how everything had gotten to this point. I told him that he was 54 years old, and that being sorry was a beginning, not a conclusion, and that the choices we make as adults belong to us regardless of what influences us toward them. He said I was right. I said I usually was. He almost smiled. It was the most honest moment we had shared in years. Rebecca left without making eye contact. In the months since that birthday, Thomas calls on Sunday evenings. He came in March and fixed the back gate that had been sticking since autumn. He did not call ahead. He simply arrived on a Saturday morning with his tools and fixed it and then came inside and had coffee with me at the kitchen table. And we talked for 2 hours about nothing urgent, about the garden and about a book I had been reading and about a story he had seen on the news. And it was the most normal conversation we had shared in years. He came for Easter and we planted tomatoes together in the kitchen garden the way we used to when he was a teenager, and George would supervise with his coffee and his strong opinions about proper spacing between plants. We laughed about that. We had not laughed together easily in a very long time, and the sound of it in that garden felt like something returning that had been away too long. He calls on Sunday evenings now, usually around 7. Sometimes the calls are short, 20 minutes of catching up. Sometimes they run long and it is past 9 before we say goodnight. We talk about his work and my garden, and sometimes increasingly about his father. We had stopped talking about George for a while, which I think was a symptom of how much distance had grown between us. Now we talk about him again. Thomas will say, "Remember when Dad tried to build that bookcase, and it leaned for 6 months before he admitted it needed another bracket?" And I will laugh and say yes and add something else I remember. And George is present in those moments in the way that people who have left us are present when we keep them in conversation. I am grateful for that more than I can say. We are finding our way back to each other, my son and I, slowly and carefully, the way you find your way back along a path that has been overgrown. There are things between us that are not yet resolved and may take a long time to fully heal. I do not pretend otherwise. But we are trying, and that trying matters to me enormously. I do not know the state of his marriage, and I do not ask. It is not my territory. What happens between Thomas and Rebecca is their own affair, and I have no wish to interfere in it. I have said what I needed to say. I have drawn the line that needed drawing. The rest belongs to them. Rebecca has not returned to my house. I hold no bitterness toward her, or at least I try not to. I understand greed. I understand how a person can look at something valuable and decide they want it before they have done anything to earn it. It is a very old human failing, and it shows up in every generation and every kind of family, and I have seen it in financial documents and in human relationships, and it never surprises me anymore. What I cannot excuse is the deliberate isolation, the manufactured dependency, the calculated and sustained campaign to separate my son from his mother so that my resistance would be reduced and my isolation would make me more manageable. That was cruelty in service of appetite, and I name it for what it was. That I am 80 years old and I have limited energy for bitterness, and I choose to spend what I have on the garden and on my morning tea and on Carol and on the slow and meaningful rebuilding of my relationship with Thomas. My house is still my house. It will be my house for as many years as God gives me, and then it will pass exactly as I have determined it should pass, to purposes that reflect my values and my life, and no one else's agenda. I want to say one final thing, and I want to say it directly to anyone watching who might be in a similar situation, or who has an older parent or grandparent in their life. Age does not erase a person's competence. It does not diminish their rights. It does not make their history and their effort and their accumulated wisdom irrelevant. When someone looks at a elderly woman and sees primarily an obstacle between themselves and an inheritance, they are making a profound moral error. And if that elderly woman happens to have spent 30 years as a senior financial analyst who has been watching their behavior carefully for 2 years and has a very good attorney on retainer, they are also making a very serious strategic error. The folder was in my bag for 4 months. I carried it to every family gathering just in case. Carol knew. Sandra knew. No one else did. They thought I was reaching for a handkerchief. I was reaching for checkmate. And now I am going to finish my chamomile tea and go sit in my garden in the sunshine, in my house on my 2 acres, underneath the dogwood trees that George and I planted together in 1978, which are in full bloom right now and absolutely magnificent. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. I love to know where my friends are watching from. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, if it made you want to pick up the phone and call your grandmother or your mother, please give this a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, because I have lived 80 years and I have more stories and I am nowhere near finished. And most importantly, if your grandmother is still with you, please call her this week. Not a text message. A real call. She wants to hear your voice. I promise you that. Thank you for being here with me today. God bless every one of you.